Well, good evening, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you and back in Singapore after quite a long absence, and to have the opportunity to speak with you tonight. I have many thanks to give, but to the Oxford and Cambridge Society for helping organise, and to all my friends at the National Library of Singapore for being so hospitable and generous in hosting this lecture. It's a particular pleasure to be here because of the long-standing relationship the British Library has had with the National Library of Singapore. And I'm of course privileged and delighted to be here in my new guise as Master of Pembroke College at Oxford University. And so it's also wonderful to have the chance to meet Pembroke alumni both here and also we've been in Hong Kong. So this is my topic for the evening. It's quite a big topic, so I'm going to be fairly general about things. But let me start with one or two quotes. This is from David Kennedy, who's a Pulitzer Prize winning historian, and he was a professor at Oxford. He said, "I love libraries. I love their purpose, their testimony to the value of learning, their commitment to the preservation and codification and dissemination of knowledge, and to the importance of transmitting culture from the generations that have gone before to those who still have to come. And I love their ambience, just the feeling of entering one and seeing the physical evidence of all that learning and erudition, and remarking the silence of the studious and the absorbed is to be reminded of the meaning of reverence." Another quote from Anthony Horowitz, who is an English novelist and screenwriter. And this was about the British Library. He said, "It's a wonderful resource. I love the atmosphere, the outside courtyards. I even love the food. And of course, all the books in the world at my fingertips." And then from the 19th century, from Panizzi, who was the great British Museum librarian, "I want a poor student to have the same means of indulging their learned curiosity, of following their rational pursuits, of consulting the same authorities, and of fathoming the most intricate inquiry as the richest man in the kingdom, as far as books go." So I think these are very powerful sentiments, and I suspect for quite a lot of you here today, they still resonate. The library is a symbol of knowledge, a symbol of learning and research, and books as a symbol of a civilized society. And I think that contrasts with our recognition over centuries of the destruction of libraries, book burning, intolerance and censorship, of mechanisms of oppression and war. And I want you to hold on to that image, and largely what has to be until maybe the last 10 years, the reality of the great physical libraries and the values they embody. And I want then to now look at the communications and speed up of communications over the centuries. Robert Darnton, who is an eminent cultural historian and book scholar, really wrote of 4 epochs of communication. And they're summarized in that slide. And I think they're summarized in ways which show rather graphically the speed up. So it took rather a long time to get to the first Christian codex, some 4,300 years, he said, from the early alphabet. And then from the codex through to movable type to the 1450s, about 1,100 years. And then the sort of era of movable type and printing, a long technical relative stasis to the 1970s when the internet began to take off. So 500 odd years. And then, of course, through to the web and search engines, some 20 years. And now, really, to social media, smartphones, apps, and much more, perhaps 10 years. And so a sign that the pace of that change in communications and the way we interact with technology and information is just an extraordinary revolution. I want to share too a little bit with you now about further parts of the context, which I call behavioural change. So let me share with you some data that's come out of the UK Media and Telecommunications regulator, Ofcom, on whose board I sit. Believe it or not, text messaging had its 21st birthday in 2013. Today, the average UK consumer sends around 50 text messages a week, and 12 to 15-year-olds say they're sending on average 193 texts per week. Actually, that seems a bit low to me. I think it's probably even speeding up some more. But that was double this time last year. In 2011, 150 million text messages were sent in the UK alone, almost 3 times the number sent in 2006. And texting, as I suspect many of you younger people here know, is infinitely more popular than using the phone or talking face to face. So it does suggest a mild revolution in the ways we socialise, work and network. Now, Facebook too celebrated its first decade last month. And of course, what did it do to celebrate its first decade? It bought WhatsApp, the mobile messaging service, in a deal for 19 billion. And it made another 500 million people connected to the combined network of communication and content potential. Now, I'm emphasising the sort of 12 to 15-year-olds because it won't be very long before they're applying to universities, and they are the students of the research library and of the university that we have represented here. And a few more points about them. They're prolific social networkers, large numbers of friends, an average number of friends, 286, if you believe it's possible to have 286 friends. And for the first time now, they're spending as much time using the internet as they do watching the television. And they don't watch much linear television, they watch it all on their iPads and in catch-up mode to times to suit themselves. They're more likely to go online using a mobile phone, a device they say they'll miss more than any other. 62% of them own one, and 17% of this age group also have tablets. Tablets too are the must-have device for children who are 12 to 15, but 1 in 8 3 to 5-year-olds own a tablet. And in the UK, it was the must-have Christmas present last year. So I think you might be getting my message a bit, that things are changing incredibly fast. And that, of course, is a serious challenge to universities, for education, and, of course, for all of you who work and lead libraries. I start with a hypothesis that really these digital life habits are going to increasingly shape the way in which students will want to study and research. And what's very clear is that those habits will be carried directly into an expectation of the universities and research library provision. Now let me turn and look a little bit now about the values and purpose of libraries from various perspectives. I think one thing that I reflect, and I look at the Bodleian in Oxford or the British Library or the National Library here, libraries are trusted by their users and the public. Their core values are built on that trust, built on independence, integrity, longevity, and they're seen to work in the public interest. And you might contrast that with all the commercial firms for whom longevity means the product life cycle, which is less than, or probably less than 6 months in many applications. And indeed, not necessarily, although they might tell you so, not working necessarily in the public interest, but of course in their commercial interests. So I think, not surprisingly, something like trust in libraries is something to hold on to, even in significant times of change and disruption in our surrounding technological and information ecosystems. Professor David Eastwood, who's now the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Birmingham, and he was previously a history fellow at Pembroke College, he wrote something which I think is rather important. He wrote, "There's a deep paradox of the modern world, which is while access to information," he says, "is now facile." Well, you might challenge that, but it's certainly a lot easier than it ever was. "Access to structured knowledge is increasingly elusive, and understanding will be at an even higher premium. Left to its own devices, machinery of the new information revolution will leave people and individuals lost in a midst of half-truths." Now, I think the challenge is that most people don't know they're in a mist of half-truths. They actually believe what they get. And I think it's the job of libraries to dispel that, some of that belief. So he says universities are where essential conceptual tools and interpretive hierarchies are developed and taught, where individuals and societies find meaning and confidence to understand and thus mediate and shape the world we inhabit. I was going to say to some of you, does that remind you, some of you have had an Oxford education, does that remind you of the continuing importance and strength of the Oxford tutorial system, for which I managed to find two wonderful pictures portraying it. But the serious point about the Oxford tutorial, which enables students to debate, contest, and have to argue about what they've discovered and their knowledge, and really begin to get a structured sense of curated knowledge and deep understanding. And I think that's where libraries have got to shift to, not just provide what I call vanilla information. At the British Library, our purpose was to advance the world's knowledge, and this implicitly acknowledged the metaphor of standing on the shoulders of giants, reflected by that wonderful Paolozzi bronze sculpture of Isaac Newton, which dominates the public piazza there. Now, the mission recognizes that knowledge adds to knowledge in a rather virtuous circle, and that the library in itself doesn't necessarily take a position, but it provides the evidence base for multiple research activity, inquiry, and learning. But my Oxford colleague, Wolfram Horstman, warned that research libraries are facing a real danger and risk of perhaps drifting away from researchers and students. And he regards that as a risk because he believes that those needs of researchers and students are now very different and differentiated depending on the individual discipline and subdiscipline. And I think that message is for research libraries and general libraries that have every subject to realize that it will not be the same in the future, that the arts and humanities scholar will have a very different need from perhaps a biomedical scholar or an engineering student. And we have to accept that one size doesn't fit all and differentiate by discipline. And I think I'm yet to see that being done in a deep way in university libraries or national libraries. So I think that discipline difference will be at the core of the options for research libraries. So I do see the bookless library of the future, certainly in some science disciplines, computer science, engineering disciplines, bookless or semi-bookless. I suspect there might be the token book around. And I do see professional subjects like law, of course, becoming bookless. But I think perhaps others in, say, history, maybe philosophy, although that's even philosophy is very digital, will have different needs. So I think we shouldn't be too upset that many will never use a physical library again. And we have to reinterpret and reinvent the use of those physical spaces. So I also want to touch very broadly on what I think is happening in publishing. So, you know, some people are saying, oh, everything is available digitally. Digital publishing is the only thing that matters. It's not quite true. I don't know about in Singapore, but certainly for UK publishing. So figures from 2013 sales in the UK suggest a continuing but not precipitous drop in printed book publishing. So about 6.5% drop last year. The Publishers Association reported in February this year, though, that e-book sales are absolutely booming, both in the UK and abroad, and they're booming also in not only the consumer market, but also in the academic and research market. I've got a little aside here because it's what's very clear what's happening in the e-book reader market. E-book readers' sales are going down very, very significantly, step by step, as sort of indicated in that slide. And I think that's linked to the rise in the multi-purpose tablet. So enjoy your e-book readers, but don't anticipate that they're going to have a long life, even though e-books might well. And of course, you know as well as I do that most journals are now online, albeit in print, or a lot in parallel publishing mode because of the business model. So, you know, I don't need to give you the figures, but Science Direct, Elsevier's Science Direct claims well over 2,000 journals in its e-database, and 26,000 book titles available, and so on and so forth. And that's even before you start to look at Google's digitized book program, and they argue that they now have over 30 million digitized books, albeit for reasons of intellectual property battles, only snippets of most of those are being shown. So I think we're seeing that difference. So when senior academics, when a lot of the professoriate were doing their doctorate, the physical library was rather meaningful. And I think they perhaps are not always the best people nowadays to be understanding what is really happening and what students actually need. And I think a very, very good population to find out what libraries really need to be doing is that doctoral and postdoctoral group who have perhaps come more into these new information layers. Now, I want to give a few thoughts now just to some of the particular challenges of research libraries. And I've just listed them. I'm going to touch on most of those if I've got time. My first is digital acquisition and archiving. Now, the UK, after a 20-year campaign, has now got legislation to make it responsible for collecting everything in digital as well as physical format. That was quite a breakthrough, and it will mean that in 50 years' time, the digital publishing output of the country will be available to researchers. Otherwise, if that legislation hadn't happened, I think there would have been a very major digital black hole to the detriment of future research activity. I think that means that research libraries, whether they are copyright libraries or not, will have to take on these new responsibilities of preserving the web, preserving and archiving digital outputs, whether they're personal outputs or digital archives of organizations or whatever. And these will be multimedia archives. You know, they will contain, I mean, just take somebody who's rather famous in the UK, Stephen Fry. Well, he blogs, he tweets, he does lots of email, there's masses of YouTube coverage of him. He's a broadcaster on television and radio, and of course he's got personal websites. So he will expect, if he gives you his archive or even tries to sell it to you, that you will be able to deal with that. That's a pretty tall technological challenge, but nevertheless that will be important. And I think it's a significant difference because preservation of papyrus and of books used to be by benign neglect. That is to say, roughly speaking, if you didn't do anything for a few centuries, you know, they were still, particularly manuscripts and papyrus, they were still in good condition. If you don't do something with the digital material, well, a website has an average life of 75 days, it's probably less now, 65 days, and other material disappears even faster. So the fact is, you have to preserve and archive at the point of hoovering up this material from a website or taking in the material that you get. This is a brand new role for all of the libraries, I suspect, here tonight. The next thing is important, and I know that we're all doing some of this, is the whole question of opening up legacy collections for global access. Now, if I can be a little provocative, but I think it's pretty true, for a young generation, if the material is not findable easily on the web, it might as well not exist. So digitization programs are core functions for all of the libraries that have heritage collections. And the treasures of those libraries and digitization of those is an enormous challenge. My slide is here just giving you one example of a digitization of a treasure. It's the Book of Kells in Trinity College, Dublin. And it's a good example because it's available as an app, it's available as online, it's available to promote tourism, it's available as a colouring book for kids, it's available as a CD, and of course it's available in deep resolution for scholars to study, and of course for tourists to go and see the original. And of course it's at high resolution, so scholars can compare and contrast on the web that wonderful medieval manuscript with others. I'm also particularly pleased standing here tonight to talk a little bit about the digitization and collaboration with the British Library and the National Library of Singapore to ensure that the Malay manuscripts and letters and the early maps of Singapore and the archival material relating to Raffles are being digitized and made available for scholars and researchers and for a wide public over the net. Hosted, I think, both here and in London. And that's a great project, opening up collections. We also have to be aware about the importance of digitization at scale. So the British Library chose to digitize its newspapers. Now, if you know about newspapers, well, you know about your own at home. You leave it in the sun for one day, and it's disintegrating. So the British Library had 170 miles of newspapers, and they were all disintegrating. So it decided that it would digitize them at scale, and so far it's done 40 million pages. And so those are now available, preserved through digitization, but available and transforming research methods and the research questions that can be asked of this very rich material. The British Library also was doing the records of the India Office company. So these are administrative records, a lot of records of the Gulf region, and weather charts, maps, seabed maps. So available and of use actually to commercial shipping, commercial exploration, as well as for scholars. So although it's described as heritage material, I think what you'll discover when you make it digitally available, there are many, many more widespread uses of such treasures that you have. However, everything that's been done so far, of course, most of it has been done out of copyright. And that's quite deliberate because of the complexity of intellectual property and copyright laws. And I would urge all of you to become leaders and advocates and debaters in that field, because that will be key to being able to open up much of your collections. I want to talk to you now about, sorry, let me go back. Discovery and navigation. Discovery and navigation have been at the heart of libraries and research libraries, primarily through bibliographic data and the catalogue. However, of course, you and I know that students now just do 2 clicks on Google and that's it. So the catalogue effectively, I think, is becoming redundant, certainly as a first port of call. And I think the challenge is to ensure that you embed that metadata of the catalogue in system-wide metadata systems, perhaps through the semantic web, perhaps through linking to much broader bibliographic databases where you stand a chance of that material being found. I think, though, that there are two conflicting and contradictory things going on here. So I think people want to search very, very broadly, and then they get overwhelmed by the amount of data and redundant material that they then retrieve. And I think pulling in the opposite direction come what I see are new demands for things like kite marking and quality assurance of those resources, and helping to navigate ways through the deluge of available information. And one thing I think that libraries need to be able to think how to play a key role in is that ranking and relating and recommending and steering to kite-marked, trusted resources that only libraries can do through your professional and other skills. And I think that's a way of building on that notion of trust in libraries, that you don't have a commercial reason to promote a particular source. You're not advertising something. And so that kind of quality stamping, I think, and making sure that less information is available, but quality information is available, is a key role for the future. So that role in authentication, in peer review process, in navigation of open research resources, expertly curated, is surely a key one of the future. That, I think, and also the development of skills in people to help them develop those critical thinking skills in the student and research communities. And I think that's quite a hard one, because you have to persuade faculty and teachers to embody that kind of program within the curriculum or within the packed term of an undergraduate course, say. And I think that's very, very critical, because although we find that students are technologically savvy, they are not savvy when it comes to assessing information and understanding about sources, about plagiarism, about evaluation, and so on. So I think that's, again, a very major new role for libraries. I'd like to just go back, because I just missed one or two things. I'd like to go back to big data, I call it. This is a book which I recommend to anybody who hasn't seen it, not least because it's by Professor Maya Schoenberger, who's a professor of internet governance at the Oxford Internet Institute. But it is an introduction to one of the major developments that I think libraries have no handle on at all. I'd love to be corrected on that, which I see as probably the most profoundly important development to changing research methodologies, both in the sciences and actually in the humanities and the social sciences. And I think it's changing our world in ways we're only beginning to appreciate. You clearly see it being exploited in the commercial world. I mean, I get mildly cross, I don't know about you, where my supermarket, which happens to be Tesco's, sort of knows my purchasing habits and then sort of sends me coupons for my next supermarket shop. And I sort of deliberately try to subvert it by putting something in my shopping basket, which I know that I never want again. But you sort of know that data is being collected about you and analytics are being used, you know, to trace everything you do. So there's a lot of this going on in the commercial world. But of course it's also true that it can be used, and it is relevant, for the collection of huge data sets, particularly being collected in the biomedical, the bioinformatics field, and increasingly in the textual field and in the social science big data sets field, which is changing the nature of research questions that can be asked. And I think that those techniques of how to use big data, how to do text mining, how to use small data to develop corpuses in, for example, English literature. I mean, the study of Shakespeare can be done in a completely different way, using data sets and analytic tools that can be derived from the commercial sector. And I think libraries have got to get into that part of the domain and develop and employ people with these data skills as data librarians, as data scientists, that I think are actually like gold dust, these people. And so you need to be able to offer them something very special to help your users. So I just want to touch finally on the future of the physical library. I get quite honestly rather fed up with people who say that there's no future for libraries as physical entities. I think many people have simplistically said that everybody is digitally connected, so why would you ever go to a library again? But from my view and experience, that's pretty well far from the truth. And it's certainly far from the truth, but it does pose a challenge for us to develop and articulate a very new vision of the distinctive ways in which spaces can be repurposed and brand new libraries can be built to serve very different, in a very different context and very different purposes. Now, I know from my experience at the British Library, people used to love to use the building, even if they never went into a reading room. So it was that proximity to that concept of knowledge and authors and that sort of intellectual excitement that people just wanted to hang out there, even though, of course, all that they would do would be digital activities and use of the web. And I think some of that, the Bodleian is developing the new Bodleian into something called the Western Building, which is transforming into new kinds of spaces for scholars and new spaces for the public to come in and interact with the treasures of Oxford and the treasures of the Bodleian. And there's going to be a scholars' centre, seminar rooms for research and student interactions, so that they can still interact with original manuscripts and original materials and documents in very special ways. And I think that was my experience at the British Library. So the more we digitized, we put the Codex Sinaiticus online. Now, it's not a pretty manuscript. It's got no beautiful illuminations. And it's in Greek, which most people can't read. And yet half the world wanted to come in awe of that artifact, if you like, because they'd seen it on the web. And infinitely more, of course, that happens if you happen to have, some of the most beautiful illuminated manuscripts in the world. And I know you have some here in Singapore. So digitize them, of course, but also put them out on exhibition and for study. And people will continue to come. So I think there's nothing in my experience which suggests that the new kinds of physical spaces where people will work much more in groups, because there's a lot more educational activity done in teams. So group spaces, even silent spaces. Silent spaces, by the way, have come back into vogue in what used to be university libraries, now fashionably called learning centres or some such thing, where they had to reinvent what was the library and recreate some silent spaces in these high-tech buildings, because some people and some groups like to work in those kinds of spaces. So I think I'm not complacent, but I think if you really conceptualize and change the way in which the libraries are being used, then I think people will come to them. If you wonder, by the way, what that amazing building is, I could sort of see some people thinking, does anybody know what that building is? The one on the left that looks like sort of lattice work. Piece of cake, yes. Well, it is actually, it's a symbol of civic pride built in the city of Birmingham. And it's just this year, or just at the end of last year, been opened. And it's absolutely extraordinary. And it has, for every day, I think they have got, they have really, I think, times 10 the numbers of people coming into that building. And of course it has some traditional parts because it's got some great Shakespeare collections, and so those are in sort of hallowed area, but it's also got some very, very high-tech spaces. So let me draw just a few conclusions from this, and then I'm happy to open it up to any questions or comments you want to make. I think the first thing I want to emphasize is something I've said already, which I think we've got to get away from the notion of a general research library. We have got to provide deeply differentiated services depending on the different segmented groups. That's the first point. I think the second point, from my experience, is that digital publishing is not entirely substitutional. So I think you'll find that the e-book is not a complete substitution necessarily for the print book. I think hardbacks are coming back into vogue because they become a rather more special and treasured item. The pricing might reflect this. You know, you might buy an e-book because it's cheap and convenient, but you might still like to have some printed books on your bookshelf, as we do, because it's sort of like wallpaper sometimes in our own homes. It tells you a great deal about a person, and you don't get that with a sort of digital version. And also, I think multimedia publishing, you know, maybe it's a combination of web updates and digital downloads and whatever. I think there will still be parallel and non-substitutional modes of publishing. But I think the technological changes themselves, while significant, I don't see them as quite as fundamentally important as I see the behavioral changes that are going on. And I think studying the behavior, certainly that we do at Ofcom, of the 3 to 5-year-olds, but more importantly probably and more immediate, the 12 to 15-year-olds who are about to make their choices of university. And I find it hard to conceive that they will not demand very different things from their courses and the way in which they acquire learning than perhaps generations before them did. And if they require different things in their pedagogy, then sure as anything they will require different ways of interacting with the library. I think for a long time now we've got this continuing tension between sort of open scholarly communication and rights-protected publishing. And I caricature it as the war between the nerds and the suits. And it's been going on a very long time, and I don't entirely see an end to it. And so many of you will know about, you know, the open access, open publishing models, and, you know, the paywalls or the paid content. And I think you've got to live with both of those models and advocate for changes in particularly copyright law to make, to open up at least for fair dealing and use by researchers a much wider corpus of material. And then the final point, I think, is that I hope I've given you enough hints that there's absolutely no room for complacency. I think it is not an option to stand still. It is not an option for any of our libraries to think that they can just go on doing what they're doing. But for those libraries that continually experiment have innovation, and really bring their users, and particularly their young users, into that development and prototyping process for all of your services, and adapt. I suspect for many of you, rather massively more quickly than you might have adapted in the past. Then I think there's real hope that research libraries will not only survive, but will actually thrive over the next 10 to 20 years. So I hope I've said enough to provoke you into challenge, or at least to make some comments. So thank you very much for listening, and I think we have a little bit of time for questions.
Earlier, in your talk, you mentioned that one of the enduring values of libraries is that many in public perceive libraries as trustworthy institution. In fact, I think I read a report of this many years ago in the US. It says that libraries and museums are the most trustworthy institution, more trustworthy than government. But I always find this concept very vague. How do we apply trust in libraries? Because a lot of the trustworthiness of libraries actually is derived from some other thing. For example, we rely a lot on the publishers as a gatekeeper for quality and therefore for providing trustworthy materials. So maybe you can give us some suggestion as to how we can capitalize on this perception of trust in libraries.
Yes, I mean, I think I've certainly read similar things to you. It's certainly true that libraries are a trusted brand. But I think, as I recall reading at a similar time, they're very trusted, so people are very happy that we've got libraries and then they don't use them. So, I mean, there's value in that trust if you can then translate that into use. And I think the key things is trust, because they're independent brands and they're not trying to sell you anything, and they're mostly in their dealings open and transparent. And these are all the things, with all the problems with the banks and with governments and with the CIA, and we're all being tracked by governments of all kinds. These are the values that I think you have to hold on to. Now, I think translating that into what does that mean in practice, I do think that the points I made about guiding people in skills development or in assessing sources as not propaganda or coming from perhaps a trustworthy source. Material on the open web, I'm not talking about necessarily a respectable publisher material. So guidance and kite marking and peer assessing of material in the open web, I think is a critical role that libraries could play. And then developing the skills of children right through to graduates in intelligent assessment and trustworthiness of sources is another good one. And getting involved in creating some of those sources yourself, or in putting together portals to those resources, and curating resources across the world, so that you join up, for example, I talked about digitization, but actually joining up globally the kinds of resources, I don't know, for Gulf history or something, is something that libraries can do in a way that commercial providers might well not do, because they will be driven by whether they can make a profit from it. Whereas you will be driven by, will this serve, how will this best serve the needs of researchers in a particular field? So I think that independence, transparency, and trusted brand must be held on to and developed in different ways as you develop your digital services. Yeah.
It's very interesting because I noticed that our library has started on this track as well, the SURE program, I think, because it's about how to get young readers to discern the credibility of information. I do think it's underused because, but I think there's a tension as well between the educational role of libraries. And you were saying trying to customize to the needs of the different readers. Because if you are trying to customize to the different needs, I think in a way, we're trying to respect their reading interests, maybe their interpretive preferences. And at the same time, I think we have a hidden agenda of trying to move them up. Yeah, so what is the balance you see in that? Yeah, but do you think that, the commercial is great at encouraging you to indulge in your own desires, Yeah, but the library itself, you do have this hierarchy of information processing, I suppose. And you're talking about the scholars sort of library. And maybe would that alienate the library from the lay users, Yeah. Yes.
Well, I think the point's already been made about. You want segmentation into those, but you want porous boundaries, so that a 16-year-old may well be doing a research project. It will be in the context of a school program, but you may well want to encourage them to use primary materials that they might not think about. So you don't necessarily want to have such deep divisions that they can't move quite openly between one and another. A young school child or a teenager may well be setting up their own business, and being very entrepreneurial on the side of doing their homework. And those require different services, and you want those permeable boundaries, I think, that they can move between one and another. And I think, that guidance and encouragement to do that, not in, I think, a vertical hierarchy, but actually in spaces which really help you move between them. That's a real architectural design challenge. So you don't say, effectively, you're not saying keep out. You're saying come on through and find your own way through these things. So I think I think one's seeing that in the design of quite a lot of new library spaces.
Well, thank you very much, Dame Lynne. We have to call it a day, but before that, may I invite Mrs. Yan to give our token of appreciation to Dame Lynne. Thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's the end of today's talk. So, we hope to see you again in our next Prominent Speaker series, and we'll EDM to you guys again. Thank you.